Hello, everyone. Quite a few of you still yet to join, so welcome. We'll wait a minute or so just to let more of you come into this session before I introduce what promises to be a fascinating hour. So you can see the numbers rapidly rising, so I'll just wait a minute or so. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are across the UK and the world. So the numbers continue to go up. So as I say, I'll just wait a minute or so while all the attendees join before I introduce and kick off today's webinar. For those just joined, we're just waiting for a few more people to join the webinar before we start today. So welcome. I see numbers continue to rise, so we'll start in about 10 seconds. Okay, we'll give it 5 more seconds, then we'll begin. So hello, welcome. If you could do next slide for me, please. Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Connected Places Catapult Third Thursday. Third Thursdays, for those of you who are new to this, are our regular thought leadership event. And today, I promise you, we've got absolutely fantastic lineup of speakers for you. For those of you that don't know about Connected Places Catapult, let me just give you a quick intro, just so you can set the scene of who we are and what we do. So we are a government-backed centre of excellence innovation, and we specialise in the areas of built environment and mobility. We partner with loads of organisations and bridge the gap between buyers, suppliers, innovators in industry to make sure that place leaders and their partners can access innovation, enable new services. So we're all about driving commercialisation of innovation. So we work across a vast area, and our Third Thursdays thought leadership events cover a fantastic area of the areas we focus on. But today, we've got 3 fantastic speakers for you. If you could just turn the page, please. I'm not going to go into detail because our host for the day, our fantastic non-executive director, Pam Alexander, will introduce all of our speakers. But I can tell you it will be absolutely fascinating. Next slide, please. So the plan today is we'll be on for about an hour. First of all, we're going to hear from Pam, and then we'll have a panel session. So for those of you that are interested in use Twitter, we would actively encourage you to tweet about today, and we are at CP Catapult. If you could use the hashtag Third Thursday. So you don't want to hear me, you want to hear the fantastic speakers. So I'm going to hand over to Pam Alexander, who, as I say, is one of our non-executive director. Pam has got vast experience and is really going to kind of help guide the proceedings of what will be a fascinating event. Pam, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I am really excited by today's discussion. Those of you listening and watching who are from the built environment will know that there's very little else we've been talking about but the impact on people's well-being of post-COVID and how we can take account of that in our future design of built environment and built environment services. None of this is new to us. We know what's good for people, but we haven't been doing it. And this has created a greater focus. I mean, just a couple of the pieces of work that I'm involved in beyond the Catapult. With Commonplace, we've been working with the collective led by Max Farrell to do something called Park Power, which we'll be launching later this month. And that's taken comments from 3,500 people on how important their local parks have been to them and demonstrated some of the things that they've really valued. So a lot of the 3 top areas that people have mentioned are the need for a feeling of space outside their private spaces, an engagement with nature, and an importance of quiet and relaxation. And looking to the future, the 2 things that they wanted most to be part of their lives were a connection to nature and animals and an ability to access quiet spaces to relax and unwind. At the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, we've had many visitors during lockdown, and we've just done some research on how important they felt that was. 73% of our visitors in June said that the park had been absolutely crucial to them and to their positive well-being during the period of lockdown. We like to think of our developments around the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and within it as creating exactly that 15-minute city that we're all beginning to talk about, where our local neighbourhoods provide us with what we feel we need for our health, our housing, and our well-being, as well as thinking about what we need at work and ensuring that we have places to play. So we have two real experts with us today on human-centered design and what it is that brings about our well-being, not just the things we might be conscious about, but the unconscious reactions that we have as a result of the things that have happened to us in our past lives. It's really important that we don't assume all people want the same thing in order to feel really good. So let me just introduce the two speakers before we get on to questions, which I'll be asking them, and then we'll have a short discussion amongst the three of us at the end before inviting questions from you, which I think Stephen said, please put in to the Q&A boxes. So first of all, let me introduce Sarah Niblock. Sarah is a chief executive, an academic, a journalist, a broadcaster, and an author. And since 2017, she's been chief executive of the UK Council for Psychotherapy, providing operational and strategic leadership to the country's leading body for education, research, innovation, and public engagement in psychotherapy, as well as being the regulatory and membership body. She continues to teach, research, and do public engagement with Imperial College. And having had an academic career in visual culture, psychoanalytic theory, and media, Sarah was previously Professor and Associate Dean at University of Westminster's School of Media, Arts and Design. Prior to that, she was head of Department of Social Sciences, Media and Communication at Brunel University. She's the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles, academic books, and chapters of books, and has given evidence based on her research to government select committees. Sarah is passionate about public engagement and a frequent public speaker. She appeared at the ICA, the South Bank Centre, the Latitude Festival, and is a regular contributor to broadcast, print, and online journalism. Andrea Cooper, I'm extremely excited to say, is our new Director of Human-Centered Design at the Connected Places Catapult. She's been with us less than a month, so we've got her first impressions, which will be interesting. But she's come from having founded the UK government's Policy Innovation Unit, including the Policy Lab, the Open Innovation Team, and Skyrim's Innovation Spaces. With a degree in industrial design, a master's in public policy, and a PhD in virtual reality, I'm very excited that we've captured her for the Catapult. After almost a decade in consultancy, she joined the Design Council in 2001 as their first Chief Design Officer. And here she led innovation challenges for the Departments of Health and the Home Office before establishing the Public Services by Design support programme, which is still being taken forward by the new entrepreneurial charity that is now the Design Council, where I was honoured to be on the board until fairly recently. Following that, Andrea was Programme Director for Designs of the Time before becoming the UK's first Chief Designer in local government. She's an advisor for the Grand Challenge Design Age Accelerator and the Design Museum Observatory, and has previously held national and international advisory board roles, including for the European Commission. In 2015, Andrea became the 10th female in its history to receive the Royal Society of Arts Bicentenary Medal. In 2019, she was listed by Apolitical as one of the world's most influential public sector innovators. So we are really honoured to have these two with us today. And I'm going to start with Sarah, who very kindly wrote a blog for the Catapult recently, identifying the importance of place to mental health, particularly during and after the pandemic. And she identified three particular areas: access to green space, access to active travel, and the importance of health centres and surgeries becoming more inclusive. So Sarah, give us a brief overview and insights from your professional work with people and groups of all shapes and backgrounds, and perhaps distinguishing for us between psychotherapy and psychology.
Oh, thank you, Pam, and thanks very much for having me today and for that absolutely amazing welcome. I don't think I'm saying anything that hasn't already been said. I think I'm just coming at it from quite a different perspective and offering a different solution to this problem. Instead of being reactive as we are now, I talk about how we need to enhance the early recognition and design effective responses to the local issues that are happening. So I've talked a lot about green spaces, and you've mentioned the fact that it's very much around giving people access to nature and animals. But the other aspect to that, and this is where psychotherapy comes in and is perhaps a different discourse on this from psychology, is that it's about finding social and relational solutions. The data is showing us just the real extent of the mental health crisis right now. And one of the ways that we look at that is saying that that is probably a perfectly natural and understandable reaction, that our depression, our anxiety and uncertainty is a reflection of how the world feels right now. Going to a park and being with others gives you a sense of attachment. It gives you a sense of connection with your world. It brings young and old together. It brings people together who might not ordinarily see one another. It dispels myths. So I'm coming at this from a position of needing to create attachments now. I put myself in the shoe of perhaps a single mother who's been trying to homeschool her children in a high-rise block. She's got parents who she hasn't been able to see since March. And she steps outside for the very first time, and immediately a runner flies past, knocks her almost off her feet, panting. That is a perfectly understandable and natural reaction to what is confronting us now, and why we've got to perhaps take a different approach to design. So instead of being this kind of being reactive to the problem, I think that the more that we can build ways of communities coming together to inform the changes and the transformations. So I've talked about creating open spaces. My local park, there's a guy who's, the park keeper's been made redundant, so some guy has gone in there and set up a tea shop. And no matter how bad the weather is, people come and sit outside in the pouring rain and drink tea and talk with one another. I think the other thing I talk about is obviously using our bodies a lot more. And there's lots of data. Imperial's got fantastic data about how that not only has health benefits and mental health benefits, but again, how it tends to put you in more contact with those around you. People tend to be happier and more settled if they have some control over their transportation. And then the third thing I talk about is that there's a real opportunity now to look at the design of our health services, of our support mechanisms for this exponential rise in mental health issues, that we need to find ways to meet people where they are. So we've got to make sure that the range of services is much more comprehensive, that they are localized, that they are culturally sensitive. I mean, thinking about the warmth of the caravan project or the men's sheds, or I recently listened to a BBC podcast about a walking group in Birkenhead where therapists and clients or service users were walking side by side. If you contrast that with going to quite a clinical setting where you have to explain to the receptionist why you need to see a GP, these sorts of things I argue need thinking about. So my point is that a more psychotherapeutically informed perspective can engender a better design output and much more use and much more resilience.
It's particularly hard, isn't it, to aim for connectedness at a time when we're telling each other we've got to be socially distanced. I empathise with the young mother and the runner, because I've stopped using Clapham Common during the summer because it was too scary with people running and cycling too close. Yet I absolutely understand their need for activity, and we've somehow got to get over our minor irritations in order to design for a society that is more empathetic and thoughtful. You've talked about, when we talked before, the extent to which this is a new conversation between psychotherapists and urban designers, public health designers. How do you feel we can make this a conversation that we take forward and ensure that the professional knowledge that you and your profession have is really used by designers in public and private spaces?
Well, I think that at the moment, what we've seen is this, you mentioned at the beginning how we have conscious reactions to, you know, the kind of stepping away if we're near a runner or a cyclist. What that's exposing is just how much our unconscious feelings and thoughts are coming to the surface. And that's something that has not really been considered, I think, in the general systems of design and planning. It's the existence of that unconscious. So it's that sense that when we go out onto the streets now, in the context of glaring headlines, data, science, this real threat to people's mortality and well-being, and that of their loved ones, we enter an extremely vulnerable state, probably one that we haven't been in maybe since we were small children. You know, you're frightened of harming those around you at the same time as your loved ones being worried about you. So all of those vivid dreams we're having, it's no longer woo to say that that is kind of a manifestation of some of our innermost fears being very much at the surface. So in terms of the conversation, whereas a psychological approach might look at particular models, a psychotherapeutically informed approach is based much more on that kind of rich repository of what it means to be human. And as you say, taking into account our histories. The interesting thing about cities and urban spaces is they have histories too. And psychotherapy works systemically. It doesn't just work with individuals, it can work with groups. And there's some interesting projects going on at the moment where psychotherapists are actually analysing the histories, the personalities of urban spaces to try to understand perhaps why people feel the way they do when they use those spaces. So I think there's an interesting new vocabulary or discourse that psychotherapy can bring, the questions that it asks. It's a questioning practice, and it will ask questions and will also enable designers and planners to put one foot in the shoe of the communities that they're working with and to perhaps understand things from different perspectives.
I think that's very interesting. When I was at the Design Council, and I think Andrea will remember this work, we did some work on designing out aggression in A&E wards, particularly at Southampton. And we discovered that actually the solutions were very simple, but the doctors and nurses didn't see the need for them. They thought everything was really clear, but people arrived and couldn't understand why other people jumped ahead of them, worried about their car parking, couldn't understand why the triage doctor didn't give them medicines they wanted. And it was really a matter of bringing in urban designers and communicators to design the space in a way that was appropriate to the people who are coming in's need rather than the professionals around them. But I wonder what barriers you feel there are to collaboration in this sense between urban designers, architects, developers, all of whom are focused on the viability of what they're doing and their own professional knowledge of it. How do you believe we could overcome those barriers, and what are the priorities there, do you think?
It's systemic. It's the whole mind-body dichotomy goes back centuries, and I think it's very hard. I'm not blaming any one agent within any particular conversation around that right now. I think that this is an important conversation because I think that when we use the term mental health in the UK, that automatically has an immediate reaction that that's about mental ill health. So I think we need an agreed definition of what mental health looks like, and that really falls upon organisations like mine and certainly the World Health Organization and others. And the other issue is the fact that the real barrier at the moment is the fact that if we're feeling unsettled or uncertain or anxious, then the dominant biomedical model would assert that we are unwell or malfunctioning in some way. And so accordingly, National Institute for Clinical Health Excellence, NICE guidelines on adult depression currently favour a quite prescriptive approach to most presenting issues, which might involve prescription medication or short-term manualised cognitive behavioural therapy. And that undoubtedly has value for some, but we know that one size doesn't fit all. So there needs to be much more awareness around this. We need to have more conversation around mental health. So that is, there's an educational piece that I think organisations and professions like mine need to do. And then though, but once you understand that, the good news is, you realise this is not about people being unwell. This is actually something that we can resolve, and we can mobilise much more resilience for future pandemics or climate change at a more fundamental level within communities. So I think I think we have to have this conversation, and there needs to be a better understanding around mental health that goes beyond that biomedical model and takes into account the social determinants. The other challenge, I think, is there's barely any research into these non-biomedical interventions, which might enable pilots, sort of innovations in design solutions as the way there are for medications. So that, again, those medications have their place and are beneficial for many, but probably for the vast majority of us, the solution might lie in social relational solutions relating better to ourselves, to our loved ones, to the wider communities. And that doesn't have to be expensive. And if that's attended to, it's going to boost the economy, it's going to boost our productivity wholesale, and will have generational benefits. So I think we just need to have a better mutual understanding and have these conversations. And then, yes, I've got all kinds of ideas about what that might look like in practice.
Well, I hope we come back to that, but that's a brilliant segue into introducing Andrea. I'm very sure, though I haven't got it in front of me, that the World Health Organization definition of health extends to mental health and well-being, and that's maybe something which we now have the opportunity to take a transformational approach to, as everybody is recognizing the importance of well-being and the ways in which their well-being has been threatened by the current situation. Andrea, you're an expert not just in human-centered design, but you've also worked in local and national government. So you know the policy landscape well. How do you see policies and emerging thinking helping us now with how we design places and public services? We know how we need to change our approach, but do we know what to do, and can we address why we're not doing it?
So thanks also for that introduction, Pam, and it was great to hear, Sarah, your points there as well. And I think design is also a questioning practice. I liked your point there, because I think designers, they ask the question, how can we make this better? And actually, my experience of policymakers is that there is a lot in common, and regardless of your politics, there is a deep sense of making progress and improving the world that we live in. It's just that often different people disagree on the how. And so I do think that along with policy making, design shares that same passion about improving prosperity and well-being. That's kind of at its core. And for design, whether it's, creating a smile in the mind, a really tiny moment when you see an advertising campaign that lifts your day, or whether it is, reaping the benefits of a major infrastructure change like HS2, being able to go on super fast trains. Good design, it goes hand in hand with progress. And I think these moments that we're in right now do feel quite kaleidoscopic, because it feels like that sense of progress is being challenged in some way. And whether it's the crises of climate change or the crisis that's brought about by COVID and the economy, or even smaller crises around housing, for example, I do think there's a generational shift now where people increasingly don't fully believe that the future will be better than the past. And I think various studies have shown as much. There's a generational loss in that belief of the future. And so I do think that, this is a time of great change. And what's quite unusual about it, it is probably we think it's not the first time cities have been remade by diseases. Okay, so whether it's cholera in the 1800s, whether it's New York in the 19th century, and the way that cities have been remade by disease and by poverty. What is different now, I think, is that it is in a living memory. It's a generational thing, but there's also a synchronicity. I think it's the first time in the world where we have all experienced a kind of common endeavor. And therefore it is really, really quite remarkable. But I think there are some big trends at play, and it's not just COVID. COVID clearly is having, we're feeling that right now. I tend to think of the ABC of the big mega trends, austerity, which actually post-COVID, there is quite likelihood that we will have more austerity as we pay down our debts. Brexit is something that's certainly UK-based, big trend, and of course climate change, the ABC. But I think as a designer, I don't really come at it in terms of those points. I tend to think of it as, austerity will give us an opportunity to rebuild post-COVID. How will we rebuild the world that we want to live in? If we think about Brexit, how will we reimagine UK PLC in a post-Brexit era? And, if we think about climate change, probably the biggest of all three, how will we restructure our economy in a post-industrial global era to thrive? And how will those things enhance our well-being? Because, of course, the fundamental thing here is that our individual well-being is intrinsically tied to the well-being of the planet. So the biggest mega trend that we are going to see will be around the circular economy, and it will be about remaking of society in a way that's more restorative. And I hope as a result, we will get more well-being, and the generations that come will feel that sense of progress.
I think you may have ruined the alphabet for me forever. But thinking about the smile in the mind, I was out today and absolutely got the smile from the beautiful colours on the trees at the moment. But when we look at the built environment, I wonder, are we on the cusp of a wholesale shift in how we're thinking about health and well-being and the consequences of the building industry for it? I'm thinking of the new WELL building standard, where at IQL in the Park, International Quarter London, in the Queen Elizabeth Park, Lend-Lease have actually achieved gold in that standard. And our aspiration is that the whole of International Quarter should be a neighbourhood designed to that standard. Can you think a little for us around how business and innovators can really work more closely to deliver this change in our attitudes and to create places that support well-being and services that support well-being?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've raised already is some of the macro stuff, the big picture stuff. And I think what design does very well is it zooms both out and then into the detail. And I think it is the detail where our lived experience exists. And, one of the things I hope, perhaps optimistically, is that what we're seeing now is the end of the great project of modernism. The idea that Corbusier had that the house was a machine for living inexorably led us to smaller and smaller houses that were more and more like boxes. And house size has declined since the 1970s. And obviously we're seeing during the pandemic, particularly younger generations are actually doing communal living, which is also increasing their risk in the way that the housing market has reduced the size. So I do think that we need to move beyond that modernist ideal that was quite a kind of technocratic worldview into one that is more empathetic and one that is more connected and one that really understands the social structures and the way that people want to live. And so I do hope that in a more inclusive circular economy, that we will be more restorative and that we will have this connectivity between the way that we want to live, and we will have therefore an enhancement of communities. And I think that's so crucial, if you like, put simply, to find our human scale. And in the pre-COVID era, I think a lot of people were living in one place, working in another place. Geography was a core part of our daily lives. And in a way, we've almost gone back to an agrarian way of living for many people, where they are both living and working in one place. And I think that has led to lots of changes, which will also create new business opportunities.
I'm going to have to defend modernism and Corbusier. I don't think they're the reason why the housing market has created smaller and smaller units. And I think there are some very interesting trends now coming towards new ways of co-living that provide communal space where people can actually get the relatedness that Sarah was talking about, whilst not necessarily having to purchase a lot of private space themselves. But coming back to your point about our ability to create new businesses around this, what technologies do you see as having the most impact on health and well-being, Andrea, particularly with the home and work environment coming for many people to be the same place, and therefore not to have what I've now in the last couple of weeks understood as the liminal space in their life, where they can pause and not be so active either at the housework or at the work. Are there technologies that are going to help us create better places?
Well, look, I mean, I think we tend to talk of it in big tech, and it's quite sort of, commonplace for people to talk about how blockchain will change the world, or how automation will change the world, and AI and so forth. But actually, it's often the small tech, I think, that really impacts on our lives. And, for example, the impact that the microwave oven had on the way that people could live longer, more independent lives is absolutely phenomenal. And it changed the way that people live their lives. So for me, it's often the small tech. I don't think what we need is necessarily big tech, but we need better tech. And, I recently bought a foot warmer because my new, not having a proper office environment means that my feet get very cold. So on the one hand, I'm like environmentally conscious and worrying about the planet, but on the other hand, I'm consumer still, and I still find myself purchasing a foot warmer on Amazon. And so I think that there's quite a lot of contradictions between, if you like, these mega trends, the things I said before, like the circular economy, and then the kind of micro trends that we might see. At the moment, lots of examples, people are more energy conscious at home, and so therefore energy monitors, so that people are understanding the impact of working at home all day. Sleeping aids, I believe, is an area that's growing. My Fitbit also provides me with COVID data. So the kind of datafication, if you like, of well-being and of fitness, through to, air quality and air pollution. And I think sort of the emergence of things like micropayments are really interesting, because I think as we shift from the linear economy to the circular economy, we will have to take account of the negative externalities, the consequences of industrialization that actually are reducing our well-being. And so a good example of that would be that, if you live in a flight path and you have aircraft flying over you, can you be compensated through a micropayment system for the noise disturbance? Or if you have someone building a building site nearby, during that time that they're building the building, can you be compensated through a micropayment system? We're also seeing a massive rise, of course, in air quality devices as well, particularly in West Coast America. When you think about the forest fires, I was out there a couple of years ago and I could barely breathe. And it struck me as odd that people were buying vegan cappuccinos, but also wearing face masks. And there was something about this kind of duality of our ethics and our place in the world that I think is eroding that sense of well-being. Needless to say, Ipsos Murray study this week has showed that actually global happiness has not decreased massively. And in the UK, it's only reduced 1 percentage point. So if people are interested, they might want to dig there for a little bit more.
Well, that's very interesting. Let me bring Sarah back into the discussion. But before I do, I just want to say I'm particularly worried about gas heaters. I'm desperate for us to be able to meet outside, but I'm really worried for the planet about the number of gas heaters and electric heaters we might be turning on and using through this winter. But then you've mentioned some very positive developments in sensor technology, in apps. And one of the issues which I thought we might talk about is telehealth care. There's going to be a lot of big data around, both to help with individual challenges and to look more in a more aggregated fashion. I wonder whether either of you would like to talk about how better data could play a role in designing for better health and well-being.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that initially, I think it's a very interesting thing, and it's certainly something. I mean, my own profession had migrated. Many had been early champions of working remotely with clients and service users, but had to jump wholesale in March, and that's been an interesting journey that has also brought about, in some cases, some barriers. Which it's identified some barriers to telehealth in regard to social inequality and confidentiality. So that has resulted in some interesting adaptations that and creativity on the parts of the users of telehealth and the providers in how they adapt to that. So that is not something that is necessarily going to work unless it's properly designed. And it's the same with the therapeutic profession. I mean, you know, the whole point is about a totally neutral, supportive, non-judgmental, safe relationship with another human being. But I'm interested in a bit of data that I think would be fascinating for businesses, for local authorities, for NHS trusts. And that's just to add to your ABCs, Andrea, and that's diagnosis. Do some diagnostic analysis. I would love to have psychotherapists in residence, you know, time-limited individuals who can go in and just assess environments, who can assess organisations, look at the reception of an underused health resource, or look at why a park seems to be attracting vandalism, and just look at that experientially, drawing on what they've got, which is a huge, you know, completely unrivaled repository of people's accounts of what it is to be human living in a city. So a bit of diagnosis and assessment, and then, I mean, the E is around engagement. But in terms of the telehealth aspect, it's fascinating to see how this is evolving and how we keep needing to capture how that evolves, but continuously review it so that we don't lose the importance of the human connectedness in figures.
I was going to have empathy for the E, but I like engagement. I'm particularly interested because at Commonplace we have an enormous amount of data which is not individualized, so there's no privacy risk, but which helps us to understand how people are responding to plans and proposals from local authorities and from developers about the built environment that they care about, whether it's the neighbourhood where they live or where they work. If they're the same, then that helps, but also where they play, where they get their leisure time and where they get their enjoyment. Did you want to come in on this, Andrea, or shall I move on to my next?
Happy for you to move on.
Well, my final question really was, what can we learn from abroad in this area? Can we borrow thinking from abroad in the neurosciences, in human-centered design, in the built environment, to help us to get over the barriers and move perhaps a bit faster with the sort of speed we've managed to change things over the last 8 months in new directions, whether it's digital engagement or whether it's working from home, which so many women have been asking for so long, and so many men have now discovered they quite like. Andrea, do you have international expertise that could be brought to this, or can you see where we ought to be looking for it?
I mean, certainly, I think that the UK is world-class in design. There is no doubt about that, in the creative industries, and it is probably one of our most significant exports. And so, you know, when you look around the world, it's often the case that it'll be a UK designer that has had a hand in the airport or in the design of buildings and so forth. So I think that we have a good and fair claim on actually being world-class in this area. But that to say, you know, coming back to what I was saying before, I think, you know, this is a very unusual moment in time when the world is somewhat synchronous. And I think that businesses who are able to adapt and be agile and seize the opportunities that are presented by that change will clearly benefit. And, you know, the consequence of whether it's COVID or the wider climate change, it will not fall evenly. You know, to take William Gibson and paraphrase him, the impact, if you like, of climate change, it will not be evenly distributed across the world. And so there will be parts of the world that are really advanced in this area that we can learn from. But I think in terms of design, I think we can hand on heart say that the UK is at the forefront of practice, and actually what I like to think of as next practice, setting the agenda and leading from the front. And at this time, more than ever, those creative and innovative skills are required.
That suggests to me that we have an enormous repository of experience in the UK of working around the world in cultures that perhaps have different approaches to relatedness and the built environment, and that maybe that's somewhere that we could be drawing upon as we ask all of our built environment professionals to take a bit more attention to these issues. Stephen, do we have any questions that you'd like to inject at this point?
We do, Pam, and actually it's a kind of a UK-European one, so it's a perfect question that I think is probably relevant for you, Pam, from your background, plus Sarah and Andrea. So Mike says, having recently moved to Germany to remain European, I'm encouraged that the UK is almost alone in demanding a profit from housing. Will the housing market in the UK ever work properly until we change our value of the UK housing market, which drives so much poor well-being, as a home should be a place to live and not a source of income?
Well, thanks, and hello, Mike. I will ask the other two for their thoughts, but I would start by saying that the housing market in this country is beginning to take a great deal more attention to these issues because they create value. People will value the things that make them feel better. And whether it's fantastic public space, whether it's actually public art that creates the smile in the mind that Andrea was talking about, or whether it's the private space they have, their ability to have balconies or external space, all of the developers and house builders that I work with recognize that there is a value in creating places that people enjoy living in. So I'm not going to get into the housing market in any more detail than that, because I think we could spend a whole hour on that, and maybe we will sometime, Stephen. But let me just invite Andrea and Sarah to respond to that thought. There are parts of Europe which give a great deal more attention to the social impact of the places that they build.
So I remember very distinctly when I was at LSE studying the housing market and looking at the graphs, and there are clear policy interventions and levers. The UK, I think, has some of the smallest households in the world. And you know, the way that we've gone about design over the years and decades, it has changed. As I said, house sizes have got smaller, although there is some evidence also that COVID is not been impacted by that smaller size quite so much. Perhaps instead of Corbusier's The House and Machine for Living, it's been replaced by the House and Machine for Revenue. I do think that, you know, it's quite interesting that industrial designers created Airbnb as a business model, and that trust economy. So where I live here in Cornwall, many of the houses around me are now Airbnb properties because they are machines for revenue. So I do think that, you know, interventions do need to be made at policy level. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, we are, it will take time. But I also agree with Pam that when you do design, I mean, I also happen to live right by the housing estate that's on the front cover of the new green paper. And it is amazing, and it's using local craft skills, and it's designed in a way that really understands how people want to live. So I think we also can see those examples and share that best practice.
I live quite close to the Fitzhugh estate, which was designed in the 1950s by one of the top LCC architects. And he and his wife, who was also an architect, created the Flat Book, which actually helped people to understand how you could have an extremely good quality of life in what was then high rise at 11 stories. But I was thinking of our space standards and the way in which they've been eroded. The issue in the UK housing market is that successive governments have felt that owner occupation, the British man's home is his castle, and I don't know about the British woman and whether we consider our homes to be our castle, but more and more homes are there for rent. And I make myself very unpopular at dinner parties by pointing out to parents who wonder why their children can't get on the housing market that the reason is that they own 3 homes and therefore their children have to rent because those homes are not available to buy. But one of the things you just said was about the size of households. And I think there's an interesting development, which is the increasing number of intergenerational households in this country. We've been doing some work at the Olympic Park because we've created with one of our architects the first homes that are actually designed for intergenerational living, with independence for the older generation and the younger generation, but the ability to adapt and flex those spaces. And it seems to me that adaptability and flexibility, Sarah, has been one of the keys to those people who've managed to create, live, work in their home in a way that works. But that tends to be not in the rented sector, where people have been much more unhappy, both in the private sector and in the public sector, where space standards have been reduced very much since the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, sorry, Pam, I'm so keen to come in that I almost spoke over you then. Yeah, absolutely. Just the fact is that if you are lonely in Britain, it is associated with the same health risks as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which to somebody who may also have pre-existing health issues, it just shows the extent to which our mental well-being affects us. And all of the data around COVID and mental health has shown that those who are worst affected, who experience more depression, more anxiety, are people who a big factor in that is people's lived environments. It is living inappropriate housing conditions, substandard housing conditions, and loneliness, poor housing, inequality of access to green spaces. These things also, we've not mentioned diversity here, these things disproportionately affect Black and other minority ethnic communities. And we have to think very carefully in the way that we design and also, as you say, conceptualize living, because these are critical social causation of mental health issues. And I think if we're looking at housing, we have to think about access and affordability. And that may involve trying to overturn, as you say, Pam, a culture that has existed for many, many decades of owner-occupiers and single home ownership in many cases.
Sorry for both of you, but there is no way we're going to overturn that with any political party that I've ever come across, because too many people who are voters want to become owner-occupiers. It's a cultural issue as much as it's an issue of the housing market. But I wonder, I'm looking at the chat, if I may, Stephen, you're going to nod at me if I can. Charlotte Hill is asking, we've talked about the impact of bad design. How can we actually create positive impact through design to reduce the effects of disadvantage on health and well-being, particularly for young people?
Yeah, I would say engage them. This is the E. I'll give an example. I mean, I don't at all deny that we've got world-class design acumen, but we're not engaging and co-creating. So in terms of international exemplars, I'm quite inspired by the ethos behind the report on boosting social innovation in European cities project, which envisions planning authorities and formal agencies as kind of brokers in a relationship, a much more co-creational approach. And that I don't feel is happening, and I may be wrong, but I think that there needs to be much more communication and engagement with those who are invested in the future of cities and also may come at it from a different perspective, you know, who may not be university educated to a very high degree and making these very, very high level decisions about futures of big urban conurbations. So finding a way to engage, I think, is absolutely critical. And I just feel, so in my, and this is where psychotherapy can help. So my local authority decided it was going to pilot scheme, as many do, a way of kind of pedestrianising or closing roads to traffic to try and improve the environment. And it just did it. There was no communication, there was no engagement. And so it was left to local Facebook groups for the locals to argue over it, and they did, and it split the community between the ones who want to drive no matter what and the ones who want to walk no matter what. And it may be a brilliant design solution, and it may take 6 months, a year for that to bed in, but in the meantime the whole place is in chaos because no one's holding that.
I think that's very interesting. We at Commonplace, we worked very hard with Waltham Forest over a period of 5 years to engage local people in their ideas for what's called mini Hollands, pedestrianising and cycling by closing roads. And it started with huge opposition, and it ended with something like 78% of people very happy, including the traders and the drivers, because they'd been involved in co-creating the solutions. And I think that's a really, really important point. If Andrew will bear with me, I'm going to bring in just one more question I think we have time for before I hand back to Stephen. You've talked about, Andrew, you've talked about the challenges of trying to live for a better planet whilst at the same time trying to enjoy our vegan cappuccinos, which help us, but having poor air quality. Do you think that the fact that we have little control over some of the policy decisions that result in forest fires, Aisling is asking, whether the well-being impact of not being able to control things like air quality and the changes that aviation has brought about since lockdown ended, is that impacting on people in ways that we can support through design solutions?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I have two motivations. One, I want to keep my feet warm, and the other is I want to save the planet. I think we've all got that same sense with the disposable face masks. We want to protect our health, but we also know that many of those are ending up in the oceans because they're disposable. So I do think that we are quite conflicted in this. And I think that design has a lot to offer, but it's also a policy question, as I said, about the negative externalities of the industrial economy. And there's opportunities in really addressing those negative externalities that design can bring. And I think that that is a really kind of interesting space that we will see growing in the future. I mean, it is now over a decade since the Stern report talked about the business benefit of addressing climate change. And I think that we have, for decades seen business saying that consumers won't accept whatever it is, and then there's an answer. I think we're at a point of change now, and it speaks to both Charlotte's point about the well-being of our future generation, but also to Aisling's point about what role design can play. And design is that creative catalyst, I think, that can help unlock the opportunity that will turn those negative externalities into new business opportunities.
I'm very excited to think how you're going to inject that into our plans for the Catapult, and where we can create the sort of accelerators for innovation, for example, or the design sprints that address some of those conflicts within ourselves, but also conflicts within policy. I wonder, Sarah, if you'd like to just comment on the impact on us of those conflicts.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a sense now that we've got to help people to understand that they individually are not to blame or at fault. I think people feel quite shamed in some respects. People can take it very to heart, and that can be that in itself can create huge anxiety and a sense of hopelessness. We have to engender hope. I think that's the role of us all working together, not working in any singular silo, but working together to create the right language, to create the right feel and mood that will change the way that people think and what they do and the decisions that they make. And the more we can do those in community, in relationship with one another, then the better, using a language that meets us all where we are.
I think that's really interesting. And I think I'm going to just relate to the Academy of Urbanism, which actually has, over the last 12 or 13 years, brought together professionals from across the built environment who used to be in their own silos and are unable to relate to each other's professional ideas. And I think now urban design is much more holistic, but now we have new professions we need to bring in, whether it's those who understand digital technologies and big data and how that can help the built environment, or whether it's the psychologists and psychotherapists who can help us understand human-centered design and the needs of us both as individuals and as society. Well, I think it's time for me to hand back to Stephen, who's going to nod at me if that's the case. But before
we've got one more quick question, which I think between the three of you can probably answer really quickly if we can. I just think it's a fantastic question to end on. Cindy has asked. Oh, fantastic, brilliant.
I was going to make it the segue because I'm not sure we've got to answer it very fully, but I want to ask it because I think it sums up almost what we've all been talking about. Cindy Regalado says, the pandemic has blurred or even merged the lines between life and work. Under current circumstances and for our mental health, the messiness and complexity of this can't be denied or pushed aside any longer. How can or how is the built environment reflecting and embracing this reality? I think in a way that's been the question we've been trying to answer for the last hour. And I think some of the very interesting points both our speakers have made take us quite a long way to understanding how possible it is to address the question, although we may not yet have the answers. And I think from Sarah, I'd take, so we need to be working together, but also working with all sorts of people, not just the white middle class professionals that most of us are, but actually people out there from all backgrounds, socially and ethnically, and in terms of gender and in terms of family situation. And that listening is something which it's really very hard for built environment professionals to come together and do. But I hope very much that the human-centered design that Andrea is bringing to the Catapult will mean that the Connected Places Catapult will be creating a lot of that conversation in the future. I'm going to leave it there, otherwise you won't be able to close properly for us. So I'm sorry we didn't actually all answer your question, but I hope you didn't mind me having a go at it, Cindy. Over to you then, Stephen.
Thank you, Pam. I'd just like to say thank you, Pam, Sarah and Andrea, for an absolutely fascinating hour. I think I'm going to request something unusual. We haven't done this before, but maybe in the new year we can reconvene the three of you, because I think this is a subject that will kind of continue to obviously be a challenge, an opportunity for lots of individuals and organisations. So maybe we can in the new year reflect on what's happened over the coming months. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who've joined us today. We do have a lot of events that we're organising, and we kind of actively encourage you to check out our website, cp.catapult.org.uk, to kind of see what events we've got coming up. We've got, whether you're an SME, a local authority, government organisation, or a large company,